My name is Tanya Sheehan, and I am the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Art at Colby College. I am thrilled to welcome you to the second of 3 events in a public program series titled New Perspectives, Collection and Dialogue, organized by the Addison Gallery of American Art at Phillips Academy, Andover. The series features leading scholars of American art. Its aims are to highlight collecting areas in which the Addison can make significant contributions to research and teaching in American art history, to showcase the work of BIPOC, LGBTQIA+, and other historically marginalized artists represented at the Addison, and to critique the collecting practices of museums, including our own. Generous support for the series has been provided by the Lena Lobel Fund and the Alumni Lectureship Fund at Phillips Academy. I'm grateful to the Addison's director, Ali Kemmerer, for inviting me to develop this series with her, to curator Gordon Wilkins and curatorial fellow Tessa Height for their support in navigating the collection, and to head of education, Jamie Gibbons, for managing our webinar. As a starting point for action to support Indigenous communities, I want to remind us that we are on Native land. Phillips Academy acknowledges its presence on land once inhabited by the Pennacook and Pawtucket peoples, as well as the modern-day Abenaki, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, Pokanoket, and Nipmuc nations. Phillips Academy honors all Indigenous peoples who are here now, have been here, and will be here in the future. Tonight, I'm joined by 2 incredibly dynamic and prolific scholars, Robert Cozzolino and Erika Doss, who will use works from the Addison's permanent collection as a springboard for a discussion about spirituality and religion in American art. Cozzolino is the Patrick and Amy Butler Curator of Paintings at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. He has studied the role that religion played for artists such as Gregory Gillespie, Honoré Sharrer, and George Tooker, in addition to exploring art and spirit contact in his major exhibition, Supernatural America, the Paranormal in American Art, from 2022. Doss is a professor in the Department of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Her forthcoming book, Spiritual Moderns, 20th-Century American Artists and Religion, considers as case studies Andy Warhol, Mark Tobey, and others whose work has been collected by the Addison. Our speakers will begin with presentations of approximately 15 minutes each. Then I'll moderate a short discussion between them and open up the conversation to incorporate questions from the audience. Please pose your questions anytime during the event by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will address as many of your questions as time allows. And now I'm very pleased to turn things over to our first speaker, who will be Erika Doss.
Oops. Is everything looking okay there?
Looking good.
Okay, great. Thanks to Tanya for organizing this evening's conversation on the intersections of American art, religion, and spirituality that emerge from the Addison's collection. It's a pleasure to share this conversation with Bob Cozzolino and with all of you. I first began exploring these intersections through the Visual Culture of American Religions project, organized by art historians David Morgan and Sally Promy. My essay for their edited volume focused on the queer Catholic artist Robert Gober and the multiple installations he produced referencing and critiquing his religious upbringing and faith. This led to the work I did with Spiritual Moderns, 20th-Century American Artist and Religion, which, as the blurb from the University of Chicago Press states, traces the linked subjects of art and religion and proposes a revised interpretation of American modernism. And this book will be out I'm hoping pretty soon, like this month or next month. Spiritual Moderns was prompted by my curiosity about the visibility and significance of religion in the United States and art history's general disinterest in the significance, particularly in the making and meaning of modern American art. Recognizing that certain American artists, American moderns in particular, were religious, including Joseph Cornell, who was a member of Christian Science, Mark Tobey, who was a follower of Baha'i, Agnes Pelton, who embraced various metaphysical movements, including Theosophy and Agni Yoga, and Andy Warhol, who was a lifelong Catholic. Spiritual Moderns examines the tenets of their faith as expressed or embodied in their art. Focusing on artists who are clearly designated modern in the art historical canon, Spiritual Moderns asked, what did religion mean to Warhol, Cornell, Tobey, and Pelton? Did their religious beliefs and practices influence or shape and direct their art? Does religion matter in the history of American modernism? And if so, how? Americans, Jeff Charlotte remarks, worry over religion, argue about religion, tell stories about religion, not just because of our ambiguous First Amendment, which promises both freedom of and freedom from religion, but because American identity and American democracy depends on a constant renegotiation of terms. These terms include religion itself. Religion constitutes practices and attitudes, such as rituals and beliefs, that imbue a person's life with significance by linking her or him to a transcendent reality, beyond purely immanent or secular experience and understanding. Religion is also broadly understood as an organized system of belief: Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, etc., that provides believers with understandings of the nature and order of existence, the meaning and purpose of life, moral codes of behavior, sources of spiritual inspiration, and concepts of the sacred and understandings of healing. Importantly, religion in America is diverse and innovative, repeatedly renegotiated to accommodate the nation's fluctuating demographics, democratic dynamics, and personal individual beliefs. The power and persuasion of these beliefs may help explain why art history, among other fields, has largely avoided or ignored religion. For many 20th century art critics and historians, religion was simply contrary to the personal agency, intellectual rationalism, and freedom of expression associated with modernism and modern art. Artists who were religious were seemingly disloyal to a secular paradigm of modernism that, as sociologist Max Weber put it in 1918, was marked by the knowledge or belief that there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, and one can, in principle, master or understand all things. Yet religion was a visible subject in 20th century American art, corroborating its significance and its diversity in American life, and inspiring an extensive body of art that largely remains to be measured and critiqued. The Addison Gallery of American Art has numerous examples. During the interwar era, artists ranging from Howard Cook to Walker Evans were particularly attentive to the physical, institutional structures of American Christianity, like its churches. Andrew Wyeth made this painting and numerous studies of the ruined interior of a historically Black church near his home in Chadsford, Pennsylvania, an octagonal structure where Lydia Ann Archie, the oldest ordained female preacher in the African Union Methodist Protestant Church, led a congregation from 1891 until 1932. Other American artists were attentive to religious manners and mannerisms, from Innes's depiction of a Capuchin monk on the grounds of the Villa Barberini outside of Rome, to St. Gaudens's figure of a righteous religious man clutching a huge Bible, a version of the memorial that he designed for the heirs of Deacon Samuel Chapin, a prominent Protestant layman in Springfield, Massachusetts. Among other religiously themed works in the Addison is Paul Sample's scene of a New England fox hunt titled Lamentations 5:18, referencing the Bible verse that reads, "Because of the mountain of Zion, which is desolate, the foxes walk upon it," and hinting, I think, at how secular rituals often acquire religious import. This is actually central to the American imaginary, or the ideas and practices that define American identity and a sense of national belonging. Given the nation's religious abundance and its diversity, Americans are drawn to the ethos of civil religion, to the public memorials, public rituals, and public ceremonies that serve to guide and unite them in common understandings of national principles, ideals, symbols, and narratives. This includes visiting and taking pictures of national monuments, which Lee Friedlander brilliantly captures in photographs like this of tourists at Mount Rushmore. Other American moderns were attuned to the affective, emotional terms of faith and belief. Hans Hofmann titled this 1949 painting Exaltment, as in the exaltation or praise of the divine. Hofmann, who titled other works Sanctum Sanctorum and Gloria Mundi, wrote about the spiritual expression in modern painting, following on Kandinsky's admonition in The Spiritual in Art that modern art should be a form of creative transcendence beyond, quote, the nightmare of materialism, and the modern artist should be compelled toward the spiritual life to which art belongs. In 1948, the Addison organized a retrospective of Hofmann's work, one of the first, and published a collection of his essays titled Search for the Real. Hofmann, who once said that Titian's The Flagellation of Christ was, quote, the greatest picture in the world, was ambiguous about his spiritual beliefs, as were many post-war moderns, wary of the religious disdain of post-war art critics. In a 1966 interview, later published in Art Forum, just before he died, Hofmann related, "I believe in spirituality, yes, but I have to explain it in a very, very different way. First of all, what is spirituality? Gestaltkeit. This is a German word. In English, spirituality, it is the result of a sixth sense, the sense of sensibility, the ability to see or look into things in depth to discover the inner life." He added, "It's extremely difficult to explain and bring out." Indeed, for many American moderns, the scrutiny of faith, the rethinking of enlightened human relationships with the divine was difficult, a self-conscious practice accompanied by doubt. For the artist I discuss in Spiritual Moderns, religious belief was intrinsically linked with personal, sometimes painful, and often private explorations of interiority. As such, their visual mediations on modern art and spirituality were sometimes veiled or opaque, difficult for others to understand. As art historian Tom Crow observes, there are many ways of mapping a religious sensibility in art, and not all of them entail overt iconography. Among other spiritual moderns, Joseph Cornell absorbed religious teachings and rituals, including contemplation and devotion, to forge a distinctive style of modern American art that transcended solely secular, material, and commercial meaning. Cornell's religious beliefs were constituted, I argue, in enigmatic boxes and collages that corresponded to the life of spirit, the unfoldment of spiritualized consciousness that is central to the tenets of Christian Science. Cornell joined the First Church of Christ Scientist in Great Neck, New York in 1926, when he was in his early 20s. He remained a committed scientist until his death in 1972. In works like The Addison's Cage, which was included in the show Aviary by Joseph Cornell at Egan Gallery in 1949, Cornell reckoned with his religion's dictum that matter is an illusion of mortal perception, and the only true reality is spiritual reality. Understanding Cornell's fundamentally conceptual art is informed by understanding his metaphysical religious beliefs and practices, from identifying the ephemerality of matter to translating things into thoughts. Likewise, Mark Tobey's paintings, such as the Addison's Lions of the City, are inseparable from his faith in Baha'i, a religion he joined in 1918 and followed for some 60 years. Founded in mid-19th century Iran, Baha'i is a monotheistic and messianic religion focused on spiritual and global unity. Tobey's development of an all-over style of abstract art was motivated by Baha'i interest in a new world order of universal humanity. Tobey's innovative white writing can be traced to his appropriation of the revelatory calligraphy of Baha'i's 19th century founders. Andy Warhol, represented in the Addison by a 1966 self-portrait and a 1971 screen print of Electric Chair, similarly developed a body of modern art infused by his religious beliefs and practices. Raised in the Byzantine Catholic Church, Warhol regularly prayed and attended church services. Although a sexually active gay man, which the Catholic Church condemns as, quote, intrinsically disordered, Warhol was observant and repeatedly turned to Catholic ideas, subjects, and practices for creative inspiration and critique. His pictures of electric chairs, for example, part of his Death and Disaster series that he started in 1962, were grounded in his religion's particular intimacy or confident familiarity with mortality. Death is the central condition of lived experience for Catholics, the moment of divine judgment, preceded by extensive and intensive spiritual preparation. Like Jessica Mitford's 1963 expose, The American Way of Death, Warhol's death pictures revealed death in modern America. Focused especially on the moment of death, they further revealed his concerns about divine judgment and his personal misgivings about the conventional grounds that the Catholic Church used to determine such judgment. Other works in the Addison collection reveal these links between modern American art and religion. John McLaughlin, for example, spent decades honing Zen Buddhist concepts of negative space or the void in his austere geometric abstractions, aiming to provide himself and his viewers with access to reductive meditative conduits. And Melanie Harvey notes, Alma Thomas's dynamic, color-drenched canvases were certainly nurtured by her religio-racial identity with St. Luke's Episcopal Church, a historically Black church founded in Washington, D.C. in 1879. More specifically, Thomas's aesthetic focus, as she put it, on beauty and happiness was informed by her church's commitment to beauty as, quote, the doorway to truth and goodness. In paintings like Resurrection, acquired by the Obama White House and seen here presiding over a Passover Seder in 2015, Thomas reveled in the beauty of seasonal rebirth, commenting, spring delivers her dynamic sermons to the world each year, drenching one's soul with its extravaganza. Factoring religion into the history of modern American art challenges monolithic accounts of both subjects and yields compelling understandings of their cultural exchange and influence. Further opportunities to translate religious beliefs in American modernism and to develop critically informed histories of the connections between modern American art and religion are plentiful. Thanks.
Thank you, Erika. That was an outstanding critical introduction to the subjects of spirituality and religion in modern American art, seen through the collection of the Addison. That was really wonderful. I'm now going to turn things over to Bob Cozzolino, who is going to dazzle us with some very different imagery from the Addison.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Erika, and everybody for attending. Lately, I have been reflecting on what shaped me, specifically what experiences led me to certain images, including a persistent interest in religion and spirituality. What did I see when? What was happening in my life when I did? How can that tell me about what artists and artworks I care about? What has moved me deeply? Why do I want to find meaning in certain work? Why do I feel like I know artists from the past that I could not have met? How going into the archive is a way to meet them, have a conversation with them, listen to them when they are no longer physically present. What motivates me as a curator and art historian is a responsibility to give spaces and make platforms for voices, what they believed, cared about, desired, and that these things should be taken seriously. Often religion and religious subject matter has been denied in the biographies of modern and contemporary artists. But it's my responsibility as a curator to really bring this forward, especially in collaboration with these artists when possible. So why do I gravitate to what some might consider difficult subject matter, images that are hard to talk about, work that strongly evades one explanation? What has made me the curator, art historian, human being that I am? And I think this is important to have these conversations, especially when we don't have answers. But the conversations open up new spaces and ideas and enhance the meanings of works of art that are hard to know. David Wojnarowicz's A Fire in My Belly, which you see a still from right here, in the Addison's collection, done between 1986 and 87. It's been in the Addison's collection since 2012, is an example of an artwork that is hard to know, but in its elusiveness and provocative phantasmagoria, leads viewers to multiple places. It is a piece with a complicated history, in part because it consists of a few different segments, and Wojnarowicz did not screen it as an authoritative print in his lifetime. It was filmed in Mexico, Puerto Rico, and New York, and consists of nearly 30 minutes of content. And it has, there's in the archive in progress storyboards, but it was never fully finished. Wojnarowicz showed an in-progress cut to friend and collaborator James Romberger, who reported that the artist disassembled the film for other projects afterwards. 2 years before a 1990 retrospective in Normal, Illinois, Wojnarowicz told the curator Barry Blinderman that A Fire in My Belly was completed and 30 minutes long. He noted, and this is Wojnarowicz, quote, "There are sections pertaining to power and control, images of street beggars and little children blowing 10-foot-long flames among cars at an intersection, images of armored trucks picking up bank receipts, images of loaves of bread being sewn up, as well as a human mouth, control and silencing through economics. There are invasive aspects of Christianity played against images of Day of the Dead and the earthquake buildings and mummies of northern Mexico. There are symbols of rage and the need for release," end quote. One can see 21 minutes of Wojnarowicz's footage on YouTube, courtesy of the Fales Library at NYU, which cares for the artist's papers. One segment is 13 minutes long, another 7 back to back. The Addison's version, which I have not been able to screen, is most likely a 4-minute, 15-second version created by Bart Everly, with direction from curator Jonathan Katz, with permission from the Wojnarowicz estate for use in the exhibition Hide and Seek Difference in Desire in American Portraiture at the National Portrait Gallery. This was in 2010. Some of you may have seen it. The film is not reproduced or mentioned in the catalog for the show, and it's not in the exhibition checklist, but it was the most notorious work in that exhibition because of 11 seconds that show ants crawling over a crucifix, and that's the still you see here. A cut of this was not in the 1998 retrospective that Wojnarowicz had at the New Museum or the recent 2018 retrospective at the Whitney. In 2010, Bill Donahue, the president of the Catholic League, along with several House Republicans, including Representative Eric Cantor of Virginia and Jack Kingston of Georgia, demanded that the piece be pulled from the exhibition because they deemed it offensive to Catholics. And the director did. In response, the art community and others demonstrated at the National Portrait Gallery. A pop-up screening gallery appeared in front of the building, and several museums and artist spaces across the US held screenings in support of Wojnarowicz's piece and the curators of the exhibition. This aggressive negative response to Wojnarowicz's use of Catholic religious imagery had occurred in his lifetime. In 1990, when his first retrospective was on view in Normal, Illinois, Reverend Donald Wildman of the American Family Association, along with Representative Dana Rohrabacher of California, accused Wojnarowicz of obscenity after getting a hold of the catalog for the show and started a smear campaign, misrepresenting the broader context of his work. It, like the hide and seek controversy 20 years later, was also explicitly an LGBTQ hate attack motivated by fear and bigotry. One of the pieces at the heart of the 1990 attack, which was also an attempt to delegitimate and take down the National Endowment for the Arts, was Wojnarowicz's piece Untitled, Genet after Versailles from 1979. The artist discussed his use of Christ in the upper right-hand corner. Quote, "I was thinking about medicine in terms of how it's used as a benevolent treatment of an illness, or else it's used by sensitive people in order to nullify their sense of life or what their lives feel like living in this societal structure. So I thought about my upbringing. I thought about what I had been taught about Jesus Christ when I was young and how he took on the suffering of all the people in the world. And I wanted to create a modern image of that if it were alive physically before me in the streets of the Lower East Side. I wanted to make a symbol that would show that he would take on the suffering of the vast amounts of addiction that I saw on the street. And I did this because I saw very little treatment available for people who had this illness." End quote. Wojnarowicz was raised Catholic and spent his early years in Catholic school. He has spoken and written about how difficult this part of an already traumatic childhood it was, but he used this kind of religious imagery throughout his career in works like Mexican Crucifix from 1986-87, and others, weaving it in and out of his other imagery in purposeful and meaningful ways. The images were potent, and he explored in numerous works the ways in which they could be separated from the weaponization of religion as a policing of imposed morals, and regained their capacity to recenter the body, bodily experience, and sensuality, even as they reach toward the intangible and infinite. They function in devotional practices as containers of pain, hope, redemption, and compassion. He reflected, quote, "Spirituality has become a dirty word in this society because of the destructive nature of organized religion and the controls exerted by its human structure. Myths get played out only in pop culture in the forms of toys and cartoons, animals, monsters, and fantastic creations," end quote. Some of his most personal works incorporate this imagery. Spirituality for Paul Tech, which you see here from 1988-89, is arranged like a retable, or most intimately, room 1423, or Untitled from 1988, which consists of 3 photographs he took of his lover, friend, someone he communicated with and connected with on a soul level, photographer Peter Hujar. The images were taken after he died on November 26, 1987, and they form a triptych of the body after the spirit has left. In their focus on the head, hands, and feet, they are an adoring but painful response to Holbein's The Body of the Dead Christ in the Tomb from 1521, and make the cost of government neglect of people with AIDS at the time clear and present. Paul Teck had also died from complications from AIDS, and Wojnarowicz would follow in 1992. This is the context for A Fire in My Belly, an artwork in which all versions are fragments, compromised interpretations, and contact relics. They have thus had meanings projected onto them. This is clear when one sees the version prepared for hide and seek, contrasted with the only version made public by Wojnarowicz in his lifetime. Seeing and hearing the first minute of each of these illuminates the powerful ways in which Wojnarowicz deployed religious imagery purposefully, indebted to his awareness of Catholic ritual and the meaning and use of the body in earlier Catholic icons and images of saints. The version that was made for hide and seek with the approval by the estate long after his death takes 2 full minutes to get to the image of the crucifix with ants crawling on it. The version that I first saw, which had a profound effect on me and made me wonder how much contemporary art was dealing with religion and in what ways, was in a 1990 documentary called Silence Equals Death, and it appears at the very end of this documentary in which Wojnarowicz has a very active and powerful and prominent role. And so that's the only cut that we know of that he made from the footage. And I'm going to show you the first minute of that right now, so you can get a sense of what that's like. Whoops. So that is a little bit of the cut that Wojnarowicz did make for Silence Equals Death. So the imagery that appears throughout that cut and also appears in the second half of the version that was made for hide and seek includes repetitive images that are of icons of the saints, an image that is a lenticular 2-dimensional picture of Jesus where Wojnarowicz is activating the 2-dimensional surface that it's on, making Jesus's eyes closed while he's on the cross, played by an actor. And there's repetitive images of bread, of flesh, of sensuality, of bodies, interspersed over and over again throughout this film, including also footage from Mexico that intersperses the Catholic imagery with Day of the Dead, cemetery images, a sugar skull, and then marigolds and flowers with burning candles in a cemetery on the Day of the Dead, and closes with images of fire, including the world on fire at the very end. So Fire in My Belly functions like, the way that I've seen it, as a portable altar. And like the devotional paintings which preceded in history and rituals to which it alludes, it functions differently depending on the subjectivity of the viewer. Jonathan Katz and David Ward wanted to be about AIDS, and certainly, in part, we have to read it against that background, even though the footage was taken before Wojnarowicz became very much more involved in ACT UP and other kinds of activist movements. in response to what was going around him in New York. So what about me? I ask, what do I desire from it? What would I project onto it? What do I make of a piece that has explicit religious imagery but remains unfinished, in progress, fragments, unresolved from the artist? What can we really know about what Wojnarowicz was doing with this and what he would have done if he finished the piece in a different way than the fragments that are still in the archive? How can we see it? And can we? Is it an ex voto or a devotional image in the tradition of Catholic mystical and devotional imagery? It includes a meditation on Christ's suffering, but moves away from it to a position that humanity is in need of the compassion and devotion that is reserved for abstract holy bodies of the past and in scripture and hagiography. What about the bodies here around us? I think Wojnarowicz is asking in this moment, in community and communion with us. Don't they need this focus, a spiritual and moral attention, a loving attention that sees the body and the self as holy? When I first saw it in 1991, at the age of 20, I responded to it in sort of that way, and it led me to a lot of the work that I wound up looking to with these kinds of reverberations by artists who their biographers weren't really talking about this aspect of their work. So thinking about that through line and what we can really know, I guess I'd turn it over now to Erika and Tanya and see if we can talk about some of these issues together.
Thanks so much, Bob. That was a really thoughtful discussion of one of the most creative and complicated artists of recent history. And thank you for also bringing our attention to that film in the Addison collection. So I thought I'd start just by inviting everyone out there in the audience, those of you we cannot see, to begin to put your questions for the speakers in the Q&A. Those can filter in as we begin our discussion with one another, and then we'll turn to those before we close at 7 p.m. Eastern tonight. So I want to invite both of you. Do you want to start with any questions for each other? I have some questions for you as well, but I thought I'd give you an opportunity to respond to each other's provocations.
I liked what you were saying about our changing response to these particular works of art, because I think that's what it's all about. They're not crystallized, they're not fixed. And are, in a sense, they might activate a spiritual or religious response, but this isn't religious art. This is modern art that might be dealing with religious issues, and I think there's a big distinction there that we have to be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm always, very careful about is looking at something that, maybe sort of scoffed at, which is intention. I think it's really important, especially when we're dealing with imagery that's this maybe hot or that can be misinterpreted because of what's it's adjacent to. And that's certainly what happened in hide and seek. I think that going back to what the artist's experience had been, how they talked about their experience, how they talked about their motivations for using this imagery is absolutely critical. I still think we also are going to make meaning of it, and it's going to be different, as you say, viewing something that was made in 1930 in the 1990s or against the backdrop today is certainly always something that we have the privilege of being able to sort of look at and think about meaning as mutable and relevant to our own times. I think that's the kind of test if art is holding up and meaning different things to different people. If we're still pulling something out of it that feels relevant and important and vital to us today. I think that with somebody like Wojnarowicz or, you deal with Warhol in your book, all of that work, I think, looks different, every year that goes by. And the more we learn about who these people really were in their private lives and what was making them tick, what were they thinking about, what did they value? And all of that has to kind of be considered together. And ultimately, I think it's about empathy, really.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to invite Bob to say a little bit more about why you might think histories of American modernism and postmodernism and contemporary art, for that matter, have had so little to say about religious and spiritual beliefs of artists. So, Erika, you've offered some compelling responses to that question. For one, religion seems contrary to the freedom of expression that was associated with modernism. Bob, how would you respond to that question?
Yeah, I think, so much of modern art's history is privileged formalism and a formalist reading. And, I think a lot of the approaches to looking at modernism that were practically dogmatized in the 1960s really tried to wring subject matter out and didn't want to get into the messy complications of what artists were dealing with regard to subject matter and meaning, and especially when it wasn't easily resolvable or not straightforward. And so much of that kind of approach dominated the way that histories were written, how it was taught, how the Museum of Modern Art was installed, for instance, as a kind of arbiter of what was supposed to be modern. And so much was left out deliberately and pushed to the edge because it seemed messy and nobody wanted to try to fit it into that kind of structure that had been made to explain, the teleological progress of modernism, which is all just a fiction anyway. So I think part of it is that hard reception of modernism and theorizing of it in that way that really wrung a lot of, that kind of aspect of it out. I mean, whether we're talking about surrealism kind of being pushed to the side during that time, because unless it was automatism or other kinds of things, and people that didn't fit in neat, tidy bins, I think has a lot to do with it. What about you?
Do you think it, well, let me ask you this. Do you
Yeah.
think it also has to do with the iconography of religion itself? That when religious iconography is seen, it can only be seen as subject matter and not as metaphor, form, concept, all of these things that Wojnarowicz clearly sees it as. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's in some ways a lack of imagination that a lot of art historians kind of had in the past of the different ways that you could use this imagery. I mean, it doesn't always have to be indexed to a specific dogma. So many artists, whether we're talking about George Tucker or Honoré Sharrer, people that I've spent time looking at, saw the broader kind of metaphorical, allegorical, and personal ways that these things could mean and how they could connect to things happening in society and culture when it felt like it was potent to make these images using this kind of iconography. And Tucker in particular was extremely forthright about saying he didn't want to, he wanted to stop short of depicting something so that it seemed like it was following a story exactly, but wanted to use being suggestive with this imagery so that people could bring to it what they found meaningful in it. And if you were really devoted, maybe fundamentalist believer in some way, you could still find something in it. But Tucker wanted to be more universal and felt that it had a capacity to connect with humanity in a broader way so that you didn't have to necessarily be a believer, but there's something in that imagery that would strike a chord with you.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a reductive assumption that if you're an artist and you paint a church, then you're associated with that church. You believe in that particular faith. Or if you talk about, a particular religion, you are a follower. And that's just contrary to, historical research and what we do in general as art historians, because it's not that reductive. And it is about metaphor, and it definitely is about symbolism and painting big pictures. But I think that there is also a sense of, religion also does it to itself. There's so many scandals, there's so many stories, and oh my God, to be associated with that is somehow, contrary to the modernist enterprise. So,
well, I also wonder, how much of it, whether we're talking about Father Coughlin in the 1930s or the culture wars in the 1990s, or what's going on today, things that were going on during the last presidency that are with us. I think often religion is, and I would say particularly, and now I'm talking about Catholicism and Christianity, often gets placed in looked with a sort of monolithic viewpoint, when it is such a broad spectrum of ways of approaching belief within the religion. And is maybe art historians of the past just didn't want to touch it because it would seem too volatile, or it would seem inherently conservative, without really looking at the different ways that artists were opening up meaning by using the imagery. And so maybe our field was scared of approaching it until relatively recently because of some of those things.
I will say it's not an uncomplicated subject.
Yeah.
You can't just say, oh, that's very religious. What does that mean? And part of my problem in putting this book together was actually doing the work required of trying to figure out, well, what is Christian Science? What is Baha'i? And part of the problem is religious studies itself. Most of the people who write about religions are followers and believers. There is sort of a paucity of critical reflection on these movements themselves. So we sort of have to participate in that as well. And it takes work to try to figure out, well, what are the tenets of belief, and the rituals, the practices. They exist. And then, because this is the United States of America and we're always about negotiation, how do they change? And how do believers actually change them in order to make the religion fit with the changing, fluctuating dynamics of who we are as a nation, what we are in the 21st century, because that's a history of religion in America. So it makes for a very complicated, but I think pretty interesting project.
And belief is so personal. It's intimate. It's something that people don't often talk about openly unless they're invited to. And so in some ways, it's always also presumptuous for us poking around in the archive, kind of like revealing and trying to understand what the intentions are. I think where those artists are talking about it explicitly, I think it's really important to bring to light, because it plays such an important role in the work and illuminates their lives in ways that I think are productive and meaningful as we look back in history. But, there are plenty of artists who made this kind of material who were not loquacious and didn't really talk. And so we are kind of left guessing, and maybe it isn't really our role to guess or presume we know what their beliefs were, how serious they were taking things, or if they were playing to a market or playing around, Well,
let me ask you.
You dealt with that, Erika, with your book.
Yeah, part of the problem here is we have to develop a critical methodology for how we're even going to begin to understand what religion means in the production of modern art. And that depends a lot on the religion itself, what its prohibitions or its acceptance of the visual and the material is. They're not all the same. So you have to be very open and sort of unbiased in terms of understanding what these particular beliefs and practices might be, but then recognize too that the artists you're discussing in particular, they're all about change. They're all about a demand. I want to be Catholic, but I do not want to be a conventional Catholic.
Right.
And I'm not going to give up on my sexual identity to be Catholic, and et cetera, et cetera. They're very engaged in that.
Let me just interject with a question from the audience that's relevant to this discussion. The question is, are curators encouraged to probe current artists on their spirituality, presumably in the process of working with them to acquire their work, to mount an exhibition? Or is it, Bob, do you have any thoughts on that as a curator?
Not really. There's no specific kind of mandate for that. I think when you're working with a living artist, my feeling is you always have a collaborative relationship with that person, and what they want to foreground is what you allow that to lead, and if you approach people about a topic and they are, like with Supernatural America, there were a lot of living artists in that exhibition, and I didn't include anybody who wasn't enthusiastic in responding to the prompt that their work was about spirit contact in some way, or contact with the otherworldly. So all of those living artists, very much felt like they belonged in a contextualized exhibition like that. If they had said no, and there was a couple people who said that's not really my thing, I wouldn't have included them. I didn't.
Let's keep talking about the identity of the artists that you've selected to share with us tonight, and then you can speak also more broadly about the artists you've studied elsewhere. I couldn't help but noticing that the artists shared tonight, correct me if I'm wrong, all identify as white. And why is that significant? What might you be uncovering about specifically whiteness in America with respect to religion and spirituality, or more broadly, race in America? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, towards the end there, I did include Alma Thomas.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Apologies.
I think the work remains to be done. This doesn't really have anything to do with that. It's just the work remains to be done. My project was based more on, I want a diverse crowd of moderns, and I want a diverse crowd of religions. I didn't want everybody to sort of be the modern Catholic artist. So that's why I picked an artist like Pelton, who was into the metaphysical religions, and I was very intrigued with Cornell's interest in following of Christian Science. I think it's a good question, but I would just say the work remains to be done.
Were there artists of color who could have fit into the narrative that you were trying to develop in that book, or do you feel like you were following a different trajectory?
Absolutely. I did, towards the end, in the conclusion, talked a little bit about House and Conwell. I talked about Thomas, and I'm trying to think who else, but yeah, sure. I was looking for canonical moderns, and that doesn't exclude anybody in terms of race or sexual identity.
And Bob, what about you in projects like Supernatural America?
Well, for the talk tonight of what to focus on with the Addison, one of the things that I really feel that I need to do in order to be invested in the work on whatever artist is some kind of personal connection. And there's a lot of George Tooker's preparatory drawings at the Addison, but I knew George and worked with him when Marshall Price and I were doing the retrospective in 2008. So I had an opportunity to talk to him about his conversion to Catholicism in 1976 and commissions he did for a church in Windsor, Vermont. I know that very well, but I want to continue to learn new things and to stretch myself and to explore talking and writing about artists that I haven't had a chance to. So tonight, it was just an opportunity to afford talking about this piece that had a big impact on me when I was much younger. And I think really stimulated my interest in artists who are using Christian iconography, but trying to do something different with it. I had art history professors when I was at UIC as an undergraduate, including Paula Wysotsky, who was my major professor there, who was really encouraging me to go out into Chicago, into the city, to go to galleries like Randolph Street Gallery and all these different other places, in the MCA when it was in a tiny place before its big building. And I saw a lot of work there at the time that was responding to what was happening in 1991 and 1992 and 93. Thankfully that was the climate in Chicago, and also at the Betty Ryman Gallery at the School of the Art Institute. So I had that ability to kind of see stuff that was being made that was provocative, and often it was using religious imagery, but seeing the screening of Silence Equals Death, something I've never really had a chance to kind of talk about. So, I think, again, that kind of personal connection with artists is really important to me. So in approaching living artists for Supernatural America, I just knew certain people were completely immersed in a spiritual practice that involved ritual and was, you couldn't take it apart from their artistic practice. People like Betty Saar, Allison Saar, Renee Stout, Barbara Bullock, who lives and works in Philadelphia, were people that were foremost on my mind, but I didn't know what it would be like when I approached them. And they, with some other people, helped be kind of like informal advisors on the project. But, that the way in is always the work, looking at it and feeling like there's something there, and then talking to the artist or going to the archive. And in the case of those particular folks, they make sculptures and objects and things like that, but it's also a spiritual practice that is about contact with the otherworldly simultaneously. And so, there are painters who do that, but mostly in Supernatural America, what I was interested in is really making it prominent in object-based material for some of these folks.
I want to just end with a couple questions from the audience. The first is, have you encountered resistance to your scholarship on religion and spirituality in art from colleagues or family or anything like that? And then I also want to add another question that's just come in. The audience member says, I'm curious about the interweaving of religion and the struggle for racial justice in the artistic practices of African-American artists, from Henry Osawa Tanner to Theaster Gates. So picking up on our conversation about race. So I leave this to both of you to answer in turn, or answer the one that you would like to answer before we have to wrap up for this evening. But thank you to the audience for these great questions too.
I'll go to the resistance question real quick. Yes and no. I think it's more a curiosity and an assumption that what you work on is indicative of what you believe. And I've given talks on Joseph Cornell, and people have come up afterward and said, wow, I had no idea you were raised Christian Science. And I say, I wasn't. That sort of assumption that what we work on is who we are. I haven't really, I think the project is about opening ourselves, opening the field to new ways of thinking about how modernism is constructed and what it looks like and who's involved, and what some of its primary values are. And it's an interesting project. We're not alone. Art history, the field of English, history in general, music history, all of these fields are sort of denying the presence of religion and spirituality as the construction of the modern. And lots of folks are struggling with these issues as well. So,
and I know we're out of time, but
no, go ahead, Bob, please.
Yeah, just to respond to the resistance. So in my work on Supernatural America, there were two artists whose families didn't want the artists to be part of the project at all. Well, one of them, it seemed like it wasn't the family, it was the gatekeepers at a gallery, a very prominent gallery, who didn't want the artist included, despite the fact that the artist talked in his lifetime in multiple places constantly about the meaning of his work in a particular group of works. And so in that case, I talked to people who knew him because I didn't know him. And the judgment call that I made was to find a different way of borrowing the work and putting it in there and showing that this artist asserted that that's what the work was about over and over and over again over many decades. And so I think, to me, I felt like that was a responsible thing to do, because we had the artist and we had a friend of the artist saying that. And I think that the gallery, to go back to the sort of earlier question about our field and modernism, is trying to make that artist this kind of pure formalist modernist, and that's not what that person was entirely about. And then the second thing, which was Miranda Hofield's question. Hi, Miranda. Absolutely. One of the areas that our field has neglected, that there's many dissertation subjects yet to be written on, is the relationship of spiritualism to American art. And spiritualism, although it's complicated because human beings are involved, was very much a reform movement that was abolitionist. Mediums were speaking out for indigenous rights. Sometimes that was awkward, but they were trying to sort of move things in what we would consider a social justice manner. And there are early conventions in the 20th century, like in Chicago in the 1920s, of spiritualists, where it's integrated. And there's many Black mediums who are advertising what they do with their pictures in the spiritualist convention. So that's a whole area that comparative religions and lots of other interdisciplinary humanities fields have worked on, but almost nobody in the field of art history has touched. So I'm going to plant that seed.
And clearly, there's been a good amount of work over recent decades on specifically Christian iconography and the work of art by African Americans. But what we clearly desperately need is a conversation that's going to bridge what's going on in African American art history to this American canon. How can we bring these two stories together? I think that would be really important work to do as well. So I want to thank both of you so much for being here tonight. And we really appreciate all the audience members for their questions. I want to just plug for all of you that our third and final event in this series will take place on Tuesday, April 18th at 6 p.m. Eastern, and will feature scholars Tobias Wofford and Lauren Kreutz, and they will be talking about the concept of Africa in the American imagination. So thank you, everybody, for being here, and we look forward to seeing you on April 18th.
Thanks, Tanya.
Next time.
Bye.
Thanks, Tanya. Bye, Bob.
Bye.